tonight. Yeah, because we got a lot of people who are going to be watching this recording. They told me so because they can't be here tonight. So everybody be on your best behavior. Let's have a really erudite discussion and show ourselves off, because people will be watching this later. Here we go. We're going to start at page 34 tonight. We are a page into the third conversation. And
Dave, actually, I have a thought that came up.
That was just going to ask if you had a thought that came up, William. Go for it.
I was talking to my client, one of my clients, about this whole idea of trusting God. And the first thing he said was, how can you trust a God who let his son get crucified? And I thought there was something there that was worth combing through. And I know that might be an overly simplistic approach to understanding the crucifixion and things of that nature, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the subject so I can give him some feedback.
Well, how did you answer the question in situ?
It was one of those things where it happened right at the end of our session, so we didn't get a chance to.
Saved by the bell, were we?
Yes.
Okay.
But I felt like I was kind of sort of saying something along those lines in the last book study. But the way he put it so like succinctly, just kind of, like, really, let's just seem like there's something there to explore.
Okay. Does anyone want to jump in here with your thoughts?
First of all, God and Jesus are the same. So that's a starting point to me,
But I think it's another version of how can God let my baby drown in a pool? How can God let a really good man die of cancer? How can you trust God? How can there be wars? How can there be pestilence? How can the innocent die? I mean, I think it's just a version of something very similar to that. But it's got a little extra pizzazz to it because it's Jesus.
Yeah, there's some sizzle on that steak.
So Brady's talking about a basic theodicy dilemma, right? Theodicy argument, God's justice and all that. Problem of evil, if God is all good and all powerful, but evil exists, then pick any two, but you can't have all three. That's kind of the idea there. So yes, that's definitely a part of it. Go ahead, Randy.
Well, so my understanding is, and I believe it was from Rohr that presented this thing, is we need a face to love. So again, God is formless. Okay, we can see evidence of God in nature, in all shapes and forms. We at least myself, will say there must be a God. This is so glorious. This is something beyond anything that man can make. But you can't love a concept. You can't relate to theology. Again, you can maybe see how it's a benefit for improving the quality of your life in the community and such, but you need to have a face for you to identify with. So Jesus's life is a physical demonstration of the nature of this formless, infinite entity, energy that really is beyond comprehension. I mean, even the life of Jesus is really hard to comprehend, at least for me. But again, the basic premise is, okay, this is God incarnate, okay? At least the 3 years of his ministry, we're seeing the demonstration of God incarnate in a human. And of course, after he ascends, he says, you'll even do greater things. I believe, and of course, this is my belief, my theology, but it's a demonstration that every one of us can have that level of consciousness that we can realize that when you see me, you'll see the Father. Now, it doesn't mean I've achieved that level of consciousness. Don't think of that. But I believe that this demonstrates there is a potentiality for a human to have a, well, again, he prayed in Gethsemane. And so I pray that they are like you and I, that they're one with you like I am. And yeah, so that being said, I recognize the crucifixion as another demonstration of the nature of God. Okay. Again, if I am the personification of God, what we see a human endure is not beyond the nature of this vastness that, again, I don't understand. So why would God let one die? Anyone, again, kind of what Dave talked about. So how do babies die? How do good people die and all this kind of stuff? Well, it happens. And again, I don't understand it, but let's just stop arguing and denying that it's wrong. It's tragic. It's heartbreaking. It's beyond comprehension, but it is something that apparently has been happening since the beginning of humans. Things happen that are not the way we would like them to be. So again, and again, why I set this premise is if the Spirit of God, what animates us, this life form, this spirit, is with all of us. So yeah, it's not just, again, as I joke around, that's sizzle on the steak because this is Jesus. But anything that's happening that's tragic that we don't like and we can't understand, make sense of, and so that still does not necessarily negate this, again, this thing that's really beyond my comprehension and therefore my language. But again, I can go keep it simple and just look at nature and how ecology, again, humans blow out carbon dioxide. Now, I'm talking a lot. I'm blowing out a lot of carbon dioxide. But the trees are going to feed me back. Just that simple thing of that balance of nature. And again, we can look at nature and stuff. Hey, every time the earth is cycling the sun, there are seasons when plants go dormant and die. You might look at a tree. Well, heck, the grass went dead around here and such. It looked like all the fields were dead. Here it is in springtime. The grass is growing back. There's a season for everything. There's rebirth in nature. Then that's for, again, this is the possibility, again, whether it's in this realm or in another dimension and such, when this life ceases to exist. Again, science says energy can't be destroyed. So I have the hypothesis that, again, there's an animating force. There's molecules that are energy and all that kind of stuff of it. Even though this physical body will decay, the energy, the animating force of myself will perpetuate. Now, again, does it also, now it's a drop in the ocean and Randy, the personality, the character of it and stuff just, goes poof? Maybe. I don't know. Can't fight it. So anyway, that's the end of my spiel.
William, can I piggyback on that?
Go.
I think somewhere it's important to realize that Christ made the decision. Jesus said, not my will, but yours be done. He made the decision. There's a great argument, struggle in Gethsemane. Can't this cup pass from me? And he made a choice to do this. It was not forced on him. This was not by God's decision. It was by God's invitation. It was by his decision that he made this choice. And so I think it's important to remember that he made a choice to do this, despite his desire, weeping drops of blood to get this to pass from him. It's insane. It's incredible to realize the personal choice. There are people make choices all the time to spare another. For example, you hear about war veterans who jump on a grenade to spare their fellows, but very often this choice of courage, in this case, was a choice of divine courage, which we can't understand. Yes, I agree. But we can certainly understand the struggle. He was very much exposed in Gethsemane. It was just making a personal choice for him. That's a very important point for me to remember.
Bill, go ahead.
Just what Randy was saying, Dave, I've been connecting a lot to, accepting life on life's terms that you've been talking about, and a little bit of Rohr's influence here of moving away from the Jesus being the final sacrifice, but instead looking at him as demonstrating a better way than what we go about in our free will. And, you know, this morning you sent out that morning myrrh on that Dutch memorial in World War II. And, you know, just as I was reading through it, I thought, well, how many people died actually in World War II? You know, that memorial was 8,000 people. And some of you haven't gotten it, Dave, you can maybe recap it, but it was a 13-year-old girl playing taps, a version of taps at a Holland memorial for all those American soldiers that died in the particular battle in Holland that gave them their liberation.
Mm.
I went and looked at World War II casualties. I don't know if you guys remember this, and I didn't, but World War II, just in that time, 70 to 85 million people perished. And when I think of the love that's demonstrated that God has given to us with Jesus demonstrating a way of love as an alternative to what we do as a result of our free will and what can happen. I mean, just that magnitude of World War II, I was just aghast about it. So Randy, what you're talking about, you know, we needed a demonstration of a better way, a way of love, and not what happens when our wills just kind of go crazy, but God gives us that free will. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it just stunned me today when I read that. I just, you know, when you were talking, Randy, about that, God was demonstrating a way as opposed to even the final sacrifice. It's not the same, you know, it's the way you answered, Dave, every time, you know, we can only love because God loved us first. That's starting to sink in for me.
That's why we have to say it after every prayer, so that it does sink in. Because it just takes the longest time to get the full import of a statement that way, you know. Now here's the problem, William. You know, a question that can be asked in what, 8 words? How can you trust a God who let his son die? You could write books about the answer. I mean, just in the few minutes that we've spent here, look how much can be said, and we barely scratched the surface. The question is there a way to try to respond to a question like that with something that's simple enough that maybe, you know, you can at least start the engagement process with your client and have him start to do some of the heavy lifting, because that's the only way it's going to get through. You know, I guess the assumption in a question like that is that, you know, death is the worst thing that can happen to a human being. And why would God allow that for his own son? And if, you know, if I'm supposed to trust this God, you know, how can I trust him to save me from the worst thing that can happen to me? But is that assumption really correct? I mean, everything Jesus points to is that death is not only inevitable, but it's necessary. Unless this seed falls to the ground and dies, you know, it can't fulfill its purpose. And as soon as Jesus was born, he was going to die. But his death on the cross was so meaningful and so purposeful that there was nothing more that he could have done to express perfect love in an imperfect world. And that death then allowed everything else to happen that has happened since. It's to your advantage that I go so that the helper can come. Well, the helper was already here, but now you don't have me to hang on to, and you will directly connect with that presence. And so it comes back to presence again, you know. But I don't know if that's everything that everybody said is a great answer, but is there some really simple way that you can reply to a question like that, which goes right to the heart of all our human fears, in a way that will start the gears turning, you know, start a conversation between the two of you.
What would have happened if he hadn't died?
He'd be very old by now. But I think if he hadn't died, then he would cease to be any kind of way shower or model for us as human beings, in terms of what God's love looks like in human form. He needed to be fully human, and the scriptures tell us that. But then he would stand outside humanity. He wouldn't be one of us, and he wouldn't have anything really to show us or to teach us as a fellow human being, you know, fully part of God's love. in a way that he asked us to emulate, but he actually actuated. So
And Jesus says, no one takes my life. I lay it down on my own accord.
But I think maybe, William, if you test the assumption behind the question, maybe that would be a way to begin a conversation that can really go someplace. But, you know, look at all the different ways that we have of trying to answer a question like that. And there are infinite more. But there's an assumption there. What is the greatest fear that is being displayed by the question being asked? And can we address that fear? See where we go from there.
Yeah. I mean, this is the client I spoke about before. He's the guy with the kid with muscular dystrophy and a wife with MS. So he is taking it in the chin, and every day is a deterioration, right? And it's getting progressively worse, and he's quite literally at his wit's end, and he goes back and forth between having days where he feels like he's accepted his role as the servant who can show up to his wife and son and be there for them, and there's a simplicity and a dignity in that and taking care of them and so on. And then days when it's just ain't there. And
William, being reminded of that background, now I hear his question differently. The question I hear is, for what can I trust God? Look at my family, look at my wife, look at my son. Just a thought.
When my belief in God actually has evolved over the last few years. So whereas before I pray, oh my gosh, let me pass this test. Oh my gosh, please, make my trip safe. Now it's evolving to the fact that circumstances happen. I've learned to accept there is no why. Why was there an earthquake in Turkey? It's a circumstance. Why did millions of people die during the Second World War? It happens. So now I'm learning to say, God is there with us along the way. Not that he will change the circumstance, but he will change the way I cope. He will perhaps send help. Give me the humility to ask for help. So it's actually has evolved over the last few years. Whereas before, oh yeah, why? Because other women have come to me and saying, why is this? And there is no why. Those are circumstances of life. Like one of my colleague, her son had this bad abdominal pain. They thought it was appendicitis. He went to the ER. It turned out to be lymphoma. Why? There is no why. And to me, I find it now useless to ask why. Because the answer won't come in my earthly life. But in the meantime, give me comfort, give me solace, give me the friends to help support me. And that I've experienced over the last few years. And I see them as messengers from God. Because I do not hear him. Some of the ladies say, oh yeah, I hear him talking to me. I go, I'm sorry, I don't hear him. I don't. Do you really hear the voice? I don't know. They say they do. She says she does, but I don't. But then I change it to say, these are messengers he has sent to me. Listen, Ellen. So yeah, there was another story. I think I've said it before, and another lady said it also, that, there was a guy, there was a flood, and he went up to the roof. Right. There was a raft that came, a boat that came, a helicopter that came. He said, oh no, God will help me. God will help me. And then he died. And then up in heaven, he goes, God, you say you'll help me. And he says, but didn't you see the boat I sent? Didn't you see the helicopter I sent? Why didn't you take it? So there's also that, like that choice, that will in us that says, I will do this, but God has sent messengers, but I have to listen.
Right.
I have to take the help that comes along.
I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. What more do you want?
Right, yeah. So the other thing too about the question, the first thing that came to mind, why did God allow this for his son? But it's the same what Gail said to me too. It's like the Son of God is God. He's the personification of God, the earthly personification. So it's that complex thing. I actually myself don't understand how, you know, the Trinity and so on, but I don't understand. I just leave it alone.
So Ellen brings us back to theodicy, which is where Brady started us off, you know, with that question of evil in the world. But also with Brady's rephrasing of the question, because yeah, I was thinking the same thing. When you put it back into the context of what this man is going through, there is going to be no rational, reasoned argument that's going to make any difference to his pain right now.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that he's going to have to journey through. But if you can help guide that journey by asking maybe some questions that test the premise of what he's dealing with, maybe it'll help him, you know, to.
Yeah, we've had some good discussions. We actually listened to part of your message on Job that you've done a few months back. And he was really, he could relate to that idea of even asking God, you know, or God saying, who are you to ask me, you know, these questions of why and things like that. And we've had some good, powerful, like meaningful connections, but like the last 2 sessions, he was just like at his wit's end, like what's the point of all of this, you know? So I'm sorry.
Can I say something too? Yeah, I wanted to say something to them because things are just turning in my head as you guys started to talk, from even as far back as Randy, when he reminded us about Jesus being the personification of God and everything. And then as everything started to type, my brain was just turning. And one of the things that came, like Dave said, was it was an example of perfect love. And we got to remember that we are Christ, we are God, and we are his image, and therefore the things that God feels and expresses, we as well feel and express these things. And I find that a lot of things that was done even by Christ as he tried to show us who God was to kind of be relatable to us. And so when it wasn't more so as though God allowed Jesus to die, but him being the representative of God was showing that he was doing anything that any parent would do for a child or any family member would do for another family member. He stepped in to die so that we, quote unquote, would not have to. And so what your client is experiencing is that I'm sure he would rather prefer to be the one in the position of dying, that his family might live. And so when all the turmoil was going on, when Christ stepped in to the universe, or what's not the threads of the universe, he did that because observing it, he did not like the pain that his people was going through. He was agonizing. And so he took the position of saying, you know what, I would die that you might not have to. And that's what he's experiencing, the feeling of, you know, I rather would be the person to die that they might not have to. And that's what makes it so sweet when you really think about the grace and the love, that perfect love of God, because he does things that we ourselves experience, that we ourselves agonize with. And when we really sit down, we realize how relatable he is when it comes to us. You know, he feels our sorrows, he feels our pain. And I know what your client is going through. There aren't any moments that I would think that if anybody was to die, you know, I would want to be in the position over my husband. I'm sure he thinks the same about me. But how, again, I'm not quite sure if I heard a story here from somewhere else, where somebody was saying, you know, imagine how could your wife and son handle it if you were the one to die first. Maybe you're the better one that's able to handle it, to taking care of them in their situation, as opposed to the other way around. But what I really wanted to bring out is that it's not more so as that God sacrifices or allow his son to die, but again, the whole concept of them being one, and that he was showing that example of what God was doing for us. He wanted to take the place. He wanted to, you know, replace what we were feeling and take the big pain and burden from off of us. So I'm not quite sure if you understand what I'm saying, but
I
those
love
are
that.
ideas that are kind of rambling
I
off
love
in my
what
head.
you just said. That was perfect. That was perfect. In fact, this guy would die
Mm.
to save his son.
Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely. So he can totally relate to what you just said.
Yeah.
I like
But
that.
it reminds me too, remember that in Texas, that shooting, it happened recently, where it was a family and the women put their bodies on top of their children. They died, and the children lived. I would do that for my daughters. I think many of us would. So yeah, it reminds me of what Anya, you were saying too. Yeah, for our children, we are God's children. We will die.
I got one more. I think because of some of the things that Beth and I've experienced, but also the kind of profound experience I've had, what I learned is not to trust God, not to expect to trust God, to manage my worldview. I just, that's not my relationship with God, to see to it that my friends are healthy and that, I could trust God even though Beth is struggling with getting well, and friends might get divorced, but my trust isn't based on managing my environment. My trust is based on my belief, my faith that He's always there for me, and that He will guide me, strengthen me, that He will be there for guidance, that He will use me the way He wants to, the way He needs to. That is that is where I can really trust God without exception.
That's a lot of ammo, Billiam.
I got some good stuff here. I got some good stuff.
You've been taking notes.
Yes, I got a full page here.
You guys are good. That's good stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone. Yeah, just all these different angles, all these different ways of looking at it. It's just terrific. Terrific.
And what Brady just said, I think I was trying to articulate something like that last week. Like, it's not about the circumstances. It's not about a wish, or a prayer that something will go my way. It's about knowing that if I am going through whatever I'm going through and I call on this relationship, it's there. And that works for me.
So, by way of segueing back into the material that is the reason for the season, what is a source of this mysterious trust that Brother Lawrence has in God? Because his life was difficult. He spent all those years, his first 10 years of life in the monastery, in a very difficult place. And now, at age 52 or 56 or whatever he's at now, he's speaking about this continual joy that he has, even though at the same time, he's realizing that he's a total failure as a human being. At least that's the way he sees himself, as a wretch, as a failure, and that he always is going to do everything wrong. The only time he does something right is when God does it for him or through him. What is his source of trust? Where does that come from? And this is kind of what we're talking about here. I mean, all the answers that were given to this question ultimately have to do with trusting that which we really can't see. Trusting that which, life is still going to be difficult, and yet we're still going to trust that somehow it's going to be okay. Where does that come from? And that's what I keep coming back to with Brother Lawrence. And so many times in so many of his sayings, we've come back to that. And yet, everything that he says, whether it's couched in Catholic guilt, whether it's couched in the culture of his time and the beliefs of his church at this time, he still comes back to this absolute rock solid trust and conviction. And the only thing that I can come back to is his experience of God's presence has led him to this trust, has led him to this conviction. It's just the repeated and constant return to presence, not thought, not reasoning, intellect, knowledge, theology, any of that. None of that really cracks the surface. But when he gets beneath all of that, and he's just in this pure place of presence, something happens that can't ever be explained or reasoned or proven to anybody else. But it convinces us, it takes us to a different place where we can do what Bill was talking about, accept life on life's terms and still live with hope and gratitude and trust. This is what I think it comes down to, that we have to experience that presence, that spirit to spirit connection with nothing in between, speaking God's native language, silence, right? To get to that place of trust. So even when we get hit with the unthinkable, the way William's client is, or the way some of us have, that we can still walk through that and get to the other side with our trust intact. Our world changed, our reality changed, having to accommodate to that changed reality, but still with trust intact. And I think the only explanation for that is this ineffable experience of presence. And that's why this is so critically important.
Yeah, Dave. To continue from what you're saying, over the years, me and my wife has realized that, well, matter of fact, I have a set of reminders that come on my computer. And one of them is trusting the Lord is ongoing. And over the years, me and my wife have come to realize that, trusting the Lord is not today and not tomorrow. It's a lifestyle. And it's a lifestyle that in trusting the Lord is not every time I will appreciate it, like it, or even want to do it. But it is a lifestyle that I give to him. Lord, I trust you because he's my parent, you know better than me. And it's a sacrifice that, a daily sacrifice that we live with. And so I just wanted to share that with you guys. That's a reminder that comes up to me every day to remind myself that trusting the Lord is ongoing, because sometimes I really don't feel like trusting him for some of the things, but it's something that is being lived out in us right now, that we're experiencing and going through, and recognizing that, it's just ongoing. There's nothing that we can do about it. Trusting him, it's ongoing.
Amen.
That's beautiful.
That is beautiful.
Amen.
Yeah. And in that ongoing experience, I guess the one of the questions is, where are we putting our focus? Because if we're continuing to focus on the circumstances, as someone was talking about, that is a perfect recipe for mistrust. Why should I trust a God that when the world is falling apart? Why should I trust a God when my family is falling apart? Why should I trust a God when I look in the mirror and I see myself, getting closer to the death process? Why would I trust God? Yet when we take all of that away and we take our very thought processes away and we come right back down to presence, there is that sense of connection. At the bottom of the dog pile of all that stuff, there's this sense of connection that bolsters the trust, that even with all this stuff going on, underneath all that, there is this connection that can't be lost. And every time I come back to it, I feel that same connection again. It's not ecstatic necessarily. It's this baseline sense. Yes, we are part of something that is larger than ourselves. Yes, the universe is a friendly place. This power greater than ourselves cares about us, knows us in some way, and it's going to be okay. So to balance the life experience with that pure presence, second half of life, with first half of life, focus on what we need to in terms of just keeping the lights on at the home. That's where I think the trust is forged and then can be carried through even the traumatic moments of life. And yes, it is ongoing. I think that's the bottom line for me. If I'm focused on all the things that are happening around me, I can get pretty much in the ditch. and my trust can start to wane and go out the window. But every time I come back to the silence, solitude, stillness, and simplicity of it all, that's when I get another dose of that presence. And then I realize, okay, it's still going to be all right. That's what someone like Brother Lawrence has to teach us. All right, so maybe a couple of paragraphs tonight so that the ghost of Frank Billman doesn't haunt me. On page 34, he says that, Brother Lawrence says that he attained a state wherein he thought only of God. And when he felt one or another temptation arising, he felt it coming on. And in view of his experience in receiving prompt help from God, he sometimes allowed it to continue until, at the propitious moment, he called on God and the temptation immediately disappeared. This is another one of those where you kind of shake your head and scratch your head, and I can tell by Beth's expression, what in the world is going on? I know. It sounds so strange. It's almost like he's playing a game. And like, have you ever seen a cat with a mouse? And the cat's got the mouse paw on the tail, then it lets it go, and the mouse starts to scurry, puts its paw back down on the tail. I mean, it's really sad for the mouse, but it's almost like he's playing that kind of cat and mouse game where I'm going to let this go on until just the last moment, and bam, I'm going to call on God and he's going to come in. And what in the world is he talking about? But I think, once again, if we couch this a little bit more in terms of what we are experiencing, Ellen said something really important that her friends will sometimes talk to her about hearing God's voice. And 30 years ago when I landed in an evangelical church, this drove me crazy because I never heard God's voice and everybody else was hearing God's voice and I wanted to hear God's voice. I wanted a burning bush. Come on, why don't I get the burning bush? Why does everybody else get the burning bush? And then I realized years later that, this is the way that they simply expressed how they heard God's voice. Did they really hear a voice? I don't know. Maybe maybe they did. Maybe they imagined they did. I have no idea. All I know is that I don't hear a voice, but I am certain when I'm hearing from God, I can say that, but I can't explain it to you. And here is Brother Lawrence trying to express the way that he is going about this practice of presence. And it's couched in a culture, 300-400 years ago, in a faraway land and galaxy and culture that we just don't understand anymore. And so it comes across to us in strange ways. But if we try to put it back into our own experience, maybe we can do a little bit better. So he's attained a state where he only thinks of God. And when he is feeling one or another temptation, now temptation is probably not the best word for us. How about an emotional trigger? We're rolling along and we're aware of God's presence, but then we get triggered emotionally and it pulls us off. What about when there is an obsessive thought that comes back into mind, something that we worry about, something that makes us anxious? Maybe it's a depressive thought. Maybe it's that we see something and we feel that stab of envy, or maybe we feel the irritation or the anger. To me, these are the temptations he's talking about. It's just the stuff that besets us all day long, that takes us off track, that pulls us out of that sense of presence and connection that we've been trying to cultivate day by day. And so when he feels it coming on, and in view of his experience of receiving prompt help from God, so he knows that when he does ask for God's help, it comes. What is this asking for God's help? Is this simply a passive, God help me, and then sitting on the couch and waiting for that help to arrive? No, I don't believe so. In terms of Brother Lawrence asking for God's help, it's moving back into that conscious presence. It's moving through the emotional trigger. It's moving through the thought. It's becoming immersed in the moment again, so all of that other stuff is displaced. And then he comes back into this.
Dave,
yeah.
When I read this, I think of him kind of practicing. It sounds like a game, but it's like he's practicing discipline in a way, in a healthy way. Like, I can practice bringing myself through these moments that are kind of hard. Do I eat that piece of chocolate or don't I? Kind of a thing with, you can tempt yourself. But I think he's practicing discipline on getting back to his presence of God. That's kind of what he's doing in a sense. And maybe it's creating muscle memory for him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember reading someone who put it perfectly, and I'm not sure who it was at this point, if it was Keating or somebody. Anyway, they were talking about, we get really frustrated with ourselves when we find ourselves through the process of either centering prayer or our times of quiet time, or just our attempts to be mindful during the day, that we're constantly being pulled off by wandering mind, thoughts that keep reoccurring, or emotional triggers. And we really start to get frustrated and down with ourselves, that there's something wrong with us, that, we can't have a more disciplined practice of presence. He said, but that's the wrong way to look at it, because everybody gets beset by thoughts and emotions. But if we look at it as something wrong with us, it's going to drive us in the wrong direction. But if we simply look at it as another opportunity to practice presence, as you're saying, Kathy, another opportunity to practice coming back to center, to rebalance, then it's just another chance to get it right, another chance to get better and better at the recovery process of coming back to center. And then everything changes. When you turn that around and look at it as another opportunity to practice what you want to practice,
right?
Everything goes back to front. I think maybe we can understand this paragraph in view of the next paragraph, all right? So the next paragraph, that in view of this, right? Okay, so the next paragraph, because of the way that he is playing this sort of cat and mouse game, because he is so sure that God is always going to be there for them, when he had outside business to attend to, he did not think of it ahead of time. But when it was time to take action in the matter, God showed him, as in a mirror, what he should do. That for some time he had been pursuing this course of not expecting any difficulties, that before experiencing God's prompt aid in his affairs, he had worried about them ahead of time. So what he's basically doing is staying in the moment. He's not worried about. So for him, because of how he thinks of himself, to be given a task like going out to buy wine in Burgundy, right? He could just freak himself out if he wanted to. He's not going to be able to do it right. He's going to mess it up. He's going to do something wrong, and he could freak out. And that's what this last sentence says. He worried about all this stuff. But what he realized is that God was always going to come through for him as long as he was present to God's presence in the moment. And everything worked out fine when he just got out of the way. It's like a golf swing. Just get out of the way and let the club head do its thing, right? And he realized that that was really the key to it. So he stopped worrying ahead of time. He stopped dealing with issues mentally before he was actually physically in the moment of the task. He just let things happen as they happened. But in his connection with God, it would work out. So it's not so much a cat and mouse game. It's about staying in the present moment throughout the present moment and not pre-worrying about things, dealing with them as they came up. And the third paragraph, I think, is also illuminating the other two, that he gave no thought to those things he had finished with, and almost none to those in which he was engaged. That after he had dined, he did not know what he had eaten. But in acting in his own simple way, he was doing all for the love of God, thanking him for directing his activities and doing numerous other acts of love, but all were done very simply and in such a way as to keep him in the loving presence of God. He's aware without thinking about it. He can't even tell you what he had for dinner. I think, something came up, it was Brady, maybe William, we were talking about when you say something and then someone asks you to repeat it. Wasn't that you guys? And he's like, I don't know. I don't know what I said. I just said it. It was just coming out in the moment. And I can't repeat it for you. I can't do a verbatim here. I'm sorry. That is the experience, I think, that he's talking about here. He enjoyed his dinner. He loved it, but he can't tell you what he ate. He went to Burgundy, he bought wine, he came back, and everybody was happy with his progress. but he can't tell you what he did. It's kind of like that, I think. And so that first paragraph that seems so difficult to understand, if you think about it in those terms, I think it makes a lot more sense.
For that first paragraph, it made me think of like psychological practices, right? Like when we're teaching our clients to be mindful and to be aware of their thoughts, if like mind wandering is when your thoughts run off and you're caught up in the thoughts. But if you're aware and present to your thoughts and you're looking at your thoughts rather than from your thoughts, basically, like that's still a moment of presence. Like that's still a moment of being fully here. And this random thought floats up and you can just observe it and be present to it. So I didn't see it more in that cat and mouse kind of a way. I just saw it as continuous presence, but one is presence to my internal ramblings and the other is shifting that presence back to God.
Yeah, Bill.
I heard something today that jumped right on that topic. I was listening, Gail was gone today, so I got to listen to jazz. And Dave Koz had a 2-hour session. And when he started his career, he was at some conference and he met Burt Bacharach, who passed away this year. And so he was kind of memorializing a little bit. And so he went over, he said, I would love to write some music with you someday. And Burt Bacharach said, can you come over tomorrow? So he's nervous as all get out. He goes over to Burt Bacharach's house and he gets in there and he starts peppering Bacharach about all of what he's done. And Bacharach says, hey, let's not focus on the past. Let's just look at what we can do right now while you're here. And I was like, that's exactly what you were just talking about. 95 years old, he said, let's just focus on creating music. And it was, he said it, Dave Koz just said it was a cool experience. And I thought it was kind of neat because most all you guys know who those guys are.
Yeah.
At least Burt Bacharach anyway.
Oh, I know Dave Koz too.
Oh, yeah.
It was pretty cool.
That's very cool.
But it was a
I
current
bet
day
Ellen knows Dave
example.
Koz, right, Ellen?
Yeah, I've heard the name, though I haven't
Well,
listened
you
to
got to
it.
start listening to Dave Koz
Yeah,
if you like
I will.
jazz.
Yeah.
I thought it was a great current example. I mean, it was today, I just thought, wow, this really fits with what we're going through with our book. And isn't that something, I experienced this a little bit when I quit my office and I started working up at LAUSD, and I'm at the end of my career and I'm being schooled by 40-year-olds who don't care anything about what I've done in my past. And it was a humbling experience to come in there and realize, it's just of what I can give value to today that really matters to this group of people. And it was just it fits with what we're talking about. I have to keep reminding myself of the fact that it's living right now and what can I apply myself.
But isn't it from the past that you gain the wisdom and you become a seasoned person? That way you can teach the others.
It is if they're willing to learn and accept it. But really, it's about just simply demonstrating it by what I'm doing moment by moment and what value can bring to the moment.
Being relevant for today.
Yeah.
But also think about what that implies in Burt Bacharach, that he had become the sage. He had become the wise man. He had graduated in the second half of life where he was no longer identified by his accomplishments.
Right.
I mean, he has this vast body of work. I mean, he's Burt Bacharach, and yet he's not identifying himself by that. It's just back to the moment. What can we create now? That's where the excitement lies. That's huge. I mean, the statement that makes about him is huge.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's
way
the goal for all of us.
He can put off his own ego and he doesn't have to hear the other person's egoic accomplishments either. Just, all of that is noise, basically.
But you bring all that experience and all of that knowledge and skill to the moment, and let's see what happens. Between the two of those guys, a lot could happen.
I wonder
Not,
what happened.
not if your ego invested in everything from the past and everything else. Now you're not present to what the possibility is right here and right now. That's huge. I mean, that so perfectly illustrates what it is we're talking about. Second half of life is becoming non-identified with first half of life values, all those roles and accomplishments and attributes, and realizing that there's something deeper that can only be experienced now. And only when we shed all thought that is concentrated and localizing in something that basically is impermanent and fleeting. To let go of that. That's what this is all about. And this is what Brother Lawrence is saying right here. You know, he doesn't have an inflated ego anyway. He thinks of himself really too deprecatingly. But on the other hand, he doesn't worry about that. He's not living in that kind of guilt, because God's presence just blows it all out. Same thing, for whatever direction you're coming from, if you're overinflated or underinflated, God is going to take you right into that perfect equilibrium in the moment, right now, right here, right? Good stuff. Let's see, maybe a couple more paragraphs. That when some outside matter diverted his mind a bit from thinking of God, he received a reminder from God that invested his soul, giving it so strong a sense of God and so inflaming and transporting it that he cried out, singing and dancing violently like a madman. This is where I wish Danielle was here, because she was the one talking about ecstatic dancing, right? So here's you got the ecstatic dancing coming in, you know? So like all the great mystics, he had these moments of real ecstasy, but they were punctuation marks. They weren't something that characterized his everyday experience, you know, especially in the next letter or the next conversation. He's going to really downplay that and take it down to just the everyday level of things that we do. That's what characterizes his practice of presence. But he did have these moments, you know, when he got diverted and when he came back and got reminded of God's presence, that it was such a joy that he had happy feet, right? He couldn't help it. That he was more united to God in his ordinary activities than when he devoted himself to religious activities, which left him with a profound spiritual dryness. Okay, so here he's coming back to earth, right? It's not about the ecstasies. He feels more united to God in just doing the everyday activities, as opposed to those that were prescribed by his order, the actual times in chapel, the times of religious devotions and ritual. Sometimes that just left him dry, because it didn't have carry the same kind of purpose that his day-to-day activities, whether in the kitchen or in the shoe repair shop, carried for him, or even going to buy wine in Burgundy. That he expressed that he expected shortly some great anguish in body and spirit, and even worse, to lose the sense of God which he had experienced so long, but that the goodness of God assured him that he would not forsake him completely, and God, he would give him the strength to withstand any evil that he might allow to happen to him. And therefore he need fear nothing, and had no need to discuss his spiritual state with anyone. Okay, so there we go back into some of the, the Catholic theological thought here. But you see where he's still coming with, even though he expects something to kick him out of presence. He's expecting that can come at any moment. You know, I've often said that no matter what you're convinced of, what your convictions lie in God and so on and so forth, you're only one trauma away from having to reevaluate the whole cotton picking thing, right? Because it's those traumas that cause us to question everything. And the world looks different from that place than it did before. And you have to expand and accommodate in order to be able to come back to a place of trust and expanded conviction. And so he's expecting this all the time. But the goodness of God is what is assuring him, giving him that blessed assurance that God, even in the worst of times, has not forsaken him completely. He's still there, even if he can't feel him or see him at the moment. And he will give him the strength to withstand whatever he's going through. And that he really doesn't need to take it to a counselor or a spiritual director. God is directly his spiritual director and counselor in that respect. And then on the next page, that when he tried to do so, in other words, when he tried to go to a spiritual director or a counselor, he always came away more perplexed. And that since he was willing to give up his life and be lost for the love of God, he felt no apprehension. That complete abandonment to God was the sure way, and one always had light to illuminate the way. I said that wrong. That complete abandonment to God was the sure way, and one always had light to illuminate the way. So when he went to a spiritual director, it really didn't help him, I would assume, because it was lying along intellectual lines. It was lying along religious or theological lines that he was being counseled by the spiritual director. But when you're willing to just give up your life and abandon yourself in complete presence, why do you need to think about it logically? The logic only messes up the process. And let's just finish off this section. That in the beginning of the spiritual life, it was necessary to act faithfully and to renounce one's own will. But after that, one experiences indescribable happiness, that in difficulties we had only to turn to Jesus Christ and ask for his grace, whereupon everything became easy. Now, this is a real deceptive passage, but what I think he's talking about here is procedural memory, muscle memory. In the beginning of this process of the practice of presence, you have to actually consciously, intentionally think about what you're doing and bring yourself back over and over again. But as that gets down into procedural memory process or muscle memory, as instead of saying the prayer is saying you, it just becomes a part of who you are, then you don't have to think about it anymore. You can be aware of it without even thinking about it. That's the easiness he's talking about. Not that life becomes easy. Life is still going to just serve up all the trauma and difficulties that it always did. But your ability to stay in God's presence becomes easier because it's just a part of who you are. It's what you are doing automatically now. And so that indescribable happiness can be also deceptive for us because it doesn't mean ecstasy, but it does mean that sense of okayness that makes the difficulties of life bearable. And so trying to just, again, put this into terms that make more sense in terms of our day-to-day experience. And then finally, that many become bogged down in penances and particular practices while neglecting love, which is the real end. That this can be readily seen in their works and was reason to see, and was the reason we see so little solid virtue. That neither skill nor knowledge was needed to go to God, but only a heart determined to devote itself to him, for him, and to love him only. So you see this dichotomy that he's building between logical thought and practices and conscious devotion to ritual and just the simple abandonment to God. And it's not that you can't bring that into your ritual and your devotions. I mean, obviously that's what we should be doing. And then the two become one. But the problem is that we sometimes get so off into these rituals and we're doing them mindlessly without the presence, and then they're just working in the wrong direction. But this is going to be a theme constantly with Lawrence between the intellectual and the logical and just complete abandonment. So hopefully that whole section really reinforced what we're talking about in terms of how presence is cultivated, how we actually get there, and that we need to have a balance between the two, between intellectual processes that we need to perform, obviously, but balanced with this time away from that headspace, that time just in pure presence. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's Anya and Christopher's bedtime by now. So. So, and William too.
That's my bedtime.
Yeah, I know.
It's
So
my,
anyway-
it's ours too.
Hey, come on. You don't have that excuse.
I'm getting tired just listening.
But at any rate, another great discussion tonight. So thanks, William, for throwing in the holy hand grenade. That was a good discussion. And I'm hoping that you're seeing the connection between the two. You know, that trust issue that we started with, the question of trust. How do you trust God when all these terrible things are happening around us? I think this is the way that you do it. You know, it's to step outside the focus on first half of life values. Step outside the mind that is always judging and comparing and contrasting and so on and so forth, and move into this place of presence. In that balance of the two is where we can build that kind of trust and that kind of conviction. And only there. I think that's the only way this happens. So, and which I believe is the way of Jesus. Absolutely. Coming back to the Father, the only way to the Father is exactly the same way. Okay, that's enough. It's time. Scotty.
Lord, thank you for this time together tonight as we search out to know you deeper and more thoroughly in our lives and encourage each other with the life that you've given us. Help us as we travel to just share your love with those we encounter and be living examples of what your children should be and how they should conduct themselves in this world. We thank you and we praise you, and we do all this in your holy and precious name, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen. All right, I know we went kind of quickly through this last page and a half. So as you chew on it this week, if anything comes up, make notes, bring them to the top next Wednesday, and you'll be the holy hand grenader. And we'll talk about that before we dive into the fourth conversation, or the fourth conversation. All right. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Christopher and Anya, Linda, Jordana, Vaughn.
Bye. See you guys
Okay,
on Sunday.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.